The evening sun was setting behind the tall buildings of downtown Chicago when Sarah Johnson adjusted her black apron and checked her appearance one last time in the employee bathroom mirror of the Bellagio restaurant. Her dark curly hair was neatly tied back, and her uniform was spotless, exactly how Mr. Romano, the restaurant owner, expected his staff to look. At 32 years old, Sarah had been working at this upscale restaurant for the past 3 years. Being the only black waitress among the staff hadn't been easy, but her warm smile and kind heart had won over many regular customers who specifically asked to be seated in her section. Table 7 needs their orders taken, Sarah called Jenny, another waitress, as she hurried past with a tray full of steaming plates. Sarah nodded and grabbed her notepad, mentally preparing herself for another busy evening shift. The Bellagio restaurant was one of the most expensive places in town, with its crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and walls decorated with beautiful paintings. The smell of fresh bread and grilled steaks filled the air as Sarah made her way through the dining room, her shoes clicking softly against the polished floor. As she moved between tables, taking orders and serving meals, Sarah couldn't help but notice how some customers would give her strange looks or whisper to each other when they thought she wasn't watching. But she had learned to keep her head high and focus on doing her job well. Her mother had always taught her that actions speak louder than words. The evening was going smoothly until Sarah noticed something unusual through the large front windows. A small figure was standing outside in the growing darkness, face pressed against the glass. At first, she thought it might be one of the local kids playing around, but something about the way the child stood there, completely still, made her pause. The weather had turned nasty, with cold rain starting to fall and wind whipping through the streets. Sarah watched as other pedestrians hurried past, holding umbrellas or pulling their coats tighter, but the child remained there, seemingly mesmerized by the warm glow from inside the restaurant. Making her way closer to the window, Sarah could now see it was a young boy, probably no more than 12 years old. His clothes were dirty and torn, his hair messy and unwashed. He was skinny, too skinny for a growing boy, and he wasn't wearing a jacket despite the cold weather. Sarah's heart ached as she watched him. The boy's eyes were fixed on a table near the window where a family was enjoying their dinner, steam rising from their full plates. She could see him swallow hard, and his hands were pressed flat against the glass. Sarah, table 12 is still waiting for their dessert menu, called out Mark, one of the senior waiters, his voice sharp with annoyance. He was one of those who had never fully accepted her presence in the restaurant. "I'll be right there," Sarah replied, but she couldn't take her eyes off the boy. Something about him reminded her of her own childhood, when times had been tough for her family. There had been nights when her mother had gone to bed hungry to make sure Sarah and her siblings had enough to eat. Making a decision that she knew might get her in trouble, Sarah walked to the front door. The restaurant had strict policies about keeping out unwanted visitors, especially those who might disturb the high-paying customers. But as she looked at the boy's face, his eyes now following a waiter carrying a large tray of food, she knew she couldn't just ignore him. The rain was falling harder now, and she could see the boy shivering. Taking a deep breath, Sarah pushed open the heavy door, letting the cold air rush in. Several nearby customers looked up in annoyance, but she ignored them. "Hey there," she said softly, causing the boy to jump slightly and take a step back. "Would you like to come in where it's warm?" The boy's eyes widened with surprise and fear, darting between Sarah's face and the fancy interior of the restaurant. He looked ready to run at any moment. Sarah's gentle smile never wavered as she waited patiently for his response, even as she heard Mark's disapproving cough behind her. She knew what she was doing might cost her the job she desperately needed, but sometimes she believed you had to listen to your heart rather than your head. The boy stood frozen in the doorway, rain dripping from his tattered clothes onto the shiny floor. Sarah could hear Mark's footsteps approaching behind her, probably coming to stop what she was doing. But before he could reach them, she gently placed her hand on the boy's shoulder. "Come on, honey. Let's get you dried off and warmed," she said, leading him toward an empty table in her section. The boy followed quietly, his worn-out shoes leaving wet marks on the floor. Some customers turned to stare, and Sarah could hear their whispers, but she kept walking with her head held high. "Sarah," Mark hissed as she passed by. "Mr. Romano would never allow this. You're going to get fired." But Sarah pretended not to hear him. She had seen too many people look the other way when someone needed help, and she refused to be one of them. She seated the boy at a small table in the corner, partly hidden by a large plant. His eyes were wide as he looked around at the fancy restaurant, his hands fidgeting nervously in his lap. Up close, Sarah could see that his face was smudged with dirt, but his eyes were bright and intelligent. "What's your name?" she asked, placing a clean napkin in front of him. The boy hesitated before answering in a quiet voice, "Tommy." His accent was surprisingly refined, making Sarah wonder about his background. "Well, Tommy, I'm Sarah," she smiled warmly. "And I bet you're hungry. Would you like some hot soup?" Tommy nodded eagerly, then seemed to remember something and looked down at his empty pockets. I don't have any money," he whispered, his cheeks turning red with shame. Sarah's heart melted at his embarrassment. "Don't you worry about that," she said firmly. "This one's on me." She knew it would take a big chunk out of her tips for the night, but seeing the hope in Tommy's eyes made it worth it. Sarah hurried to the kitchen, where she found Chen, the kind-hearted sous chef, already preparing the evening special. "Chen," she said quietly, "I need a favor." She explained about Tommy, and Chen, who had a soft spot for children, immediately began filling a large bowl with hot chicken soup. "Add extra vegetables," Chen whispered with a wink. "Boy looks like he needs it." He also slipped in several fresh rolls from the bread basket, still warm from the oven. As Sarah carried the tray back to Tommy's table, she could see Mark talking to Jenny and other staff members, all of them shooting disapproving looks in her direction. But there was also Maria, the oldest waitress, who gave her a secret thumbs up from across the room. Tommy's eyes lit up when Sarah placed the steaming bowl in front of him. He picked up the spoon with surprisingly good manners, but his hunger soon took over. He ate quickly but neatly, soaking up every drop of soup with the fresh bread. "When was the last time you ate, Tommy?" Sarah asked gently, watching him eat. He paused for a moment, thinking. "Yesterday morning," he admitted. "I found half a sandwich behind the grocery store." Sarah felt her throat tighten at his words. While Tommy ate, Sarah managed to serve her other tables too, but she kept a watchful eye on him. She noticed how he sat up straight despite his ragged clothes, how he used his napkin correctly, and how he carefully arranged his spoon and empty bowl when he finished. This boy had clearly come from a good home, which made his current state even more mysterious. As the evening grew later, Sarah could see Tommy getting nervous about leaving. The rain was still pouring outside, and the temperature had dropped even more. Making another decision that could get her in trouble, she walked back to his table. "Tommy," she said softly, "would you like to come back tomorrow? Same time?" The hope that spread across his face was all the answer she needed. "Really?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You won't get in trouble?" Sarah smiled, even though she could feel Mark's disapproving stare burning into her back. "Don't you worry about that. Just promise me you'll come back. Everyone needs a good meal, and I'll be here." 3 weeks had passed since Tommy's first visit to the Bellagio restaurant. True to his word, he came back every evening around 6 o'clock, and Sarah always had a warm meal waiting for him. She had started setting aside a portion of her tips each night to cover his meals, even though it meant less money for her own needs. The other staff members had slowly gotten used to Tommy's presence, though Mark still complained to anyone who would listen. Chen, the sous chef, had become Tommy's secret ally, often sneaking extra portions onto his plate. Even Maria had started leaving small chocolate bars wrapped in napkins at his table. On this particular evening, Sarah noticed something different about Tommy as he walked in from the rain. He had a small cut above his eye, and his left cheek was slightly swollen. Her heart sank as she guided him to his usual corner table. "Tommy, what happened?" she asked softly, placing a glass of water in front of him. The boy touched his face gently and looked down at the tablecloth. "Some older kids," he mumbled. "They tried to take my backpack, but I didn't let them," he added quickly, showing a flash of pride that reminded Sarah of someone, though she couldn't quite place who. Sarah pulled her chair closer to his table, ignoring the disapproving glances from nearby customers. "Tommy, where do you sleep at night?" she asked carefully. They had never talked about this before, though the question had been burning in her mind for weeks. Tommy shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Different places," he said vaguely. "Sometimes in the park, sometimes in the old warehouse near the train tracks." His voice got quieter with each word. Sarah felt her chest tighten. She had suspected as much, but hearing him say it made it real. "And your family?" she pressed gently. "Is there someone I can call?" Tommy's eyes filled with tears, but he quickly blinked them away. My dad. He started, then stopped. Sarah waited patiently while he gathered his thoughts. My dad owns a restaurant, he finally said, surprising her. But I can't go back, not after what happened. Before Sarah could ask more, Chen appeared with a steaming bowl of beef stew. Special recipe tonight, he announced proudly, placing it in front of Tommy. Good for growing boys who need strength. He winked at Sarah before hurrying back to the kitchen. As Tommy ate, Sarah noticed more details about him that she had missed before. Despite living on the streets, he always tried to keep his face and hands clean. His table manners were impeccable, and he knew exactly which spoon to use for his soup. These weren't things you learned on the streets. Your dad's restaurant, Sarah said carefully. Is it in Chicago? Tommy nodded, but kept his eyes on his food. Is it? She hesitated. Is it like this one? Kind of, Tommy whispered. But I like it here better. You're nicer than anyone there. He looked up at her with such trust that Sarah felt tears forming in her own eyes. Suddenly, Maria rushed over to their table. Sarah, she said urgently, Mr. Romano just pulled up outside. He's making a surprise visit. Sarah's heart started racing. The restaurant owner rarely visited during dinner service, preferring to handle business matters during the day. She looked at Tommy, who was almost finished with his meal. Maybe you should go, she said reluctantly. I don't want any trouble tonight. But as Tommy stood up to leave, she quickly added, but come back tomorrow, okay? Promise me? Tommy nodded, grabbing his worn backpack. As he hurried toward the back door, Sarah noticed something fall from his pocket. She picked it up. It was an old photograph, creased and worn at the edges. In it, a younger, happier Tommy stood next to a man in a chef's coat. Sarah's eyes widened as she recognized the man's face, but before she could process what she was seeing, she heard Mr. Romano's voice at the front door. Marcus Romano walked into his restaurant with heavy steps, his usually sharp eyes dulled by exhaustion. The staff straightened up immediately, trying to look busy and professional. But Sarah barely noticed, her mind still processing the photograph she had just seen. She quickly tucked it into her apron pocket. Mr. Romano had changed a lot in the past 8 months. His black hair now showed streaks of gray, and his once pristine suit looked slightly wrinkled. The proud restaurant owner who used to greet every customer with a bright smile now barely looked up as he made his way to his office. Sarah, Mark called out, gesturing for her to come over. Mr. Romano wants to see all the senior staff in his office right now. Sarah's heart began to race. Had someone finally complained about Tommy? Inside the office, Sarah stood with Mark, Jenny, and Maria as Mr. Romano sat heavily in his leather chair. The room was filled with awards and photographs, but Sarah's eyes were drawn to one particular picture on his desk. It showed a younger, happier Mr. Romano with a small boy, the same boy from the photograph in her pocket. Our profits are down again this month, Mr. Romano began, his voice tired. We need to discuss some changes. But even as he talked about numbers and schedules, his eyes kept drifting to the photograph on his desk. Sarah couldn't stay quiet any longer. Mr. Romano, she interrupted, surprising everyone including herself. May I ask you something personal? Mark shot her a warning look, but Mr. Romano nodded slowly. Go ahead, Sarah. The boy in that photograph, she said carefully, that's your son, isn't it? The room fell completely silent. Mr. Romano's face changed, showing a mix of pain and surprise. Yes, he said quietly. That's Thomas. He disappeared 8 months ago. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached into her apron pocket. Sir, I think you should see this. She placed the worn photograph on his desk. Mr. Romano picked up the picture, and his hands began to shake. Where did you get this? He whispered, his voice barely audible. This was taken just 2 weeks before he disappeared. Taking a deep breath, Sarah told him everything. She told him about the boy who had been coming to the restaurant, about his good manners and refined speech, about how he had mentioned his father owned a restaurant. As she spoke, tears began rolling down Mr. Romano's cheeks. He's been here? My Thomas has been here? He asked, standing up suddenly. Why didn't anyone tell me? Mark stepped forward, looking uncomfortable. Sir, we didn't know. He was just a street kid that Sarah's been feeding. Feeding? Mr. Romano turned to Sarah. You've been feeding my son. Sarah nodded, feeling uncertain about his reaction. Every evening, sir. He comes around 6 o'clock. He's been coming for 3 weeks now. Mr. Romano walked to the window, looking out at the rainy street. After the divorce, he said quietly, his mother got custody. But she wasn't taking care of him. I tried to fight it in court, but these things take time. Then one day, he just disappeared from her house. He turned back to face them, his eyes filled with a new energy. The police thought he had been kidnapped, but there was never any ransom demand. I hired private investigators, put up posters everywhere, but nothing. He looked at his watch. What time did you say he comes? 6 o'clock, Sarah repeated. But sir, there's something else you should know. Today he had a bruise on his face. He said some older kids tried to take his backpack. Mr. Romano's face hardened with concern. My son is living on the streets, he said, more to himself than to them. My Thomas is living on the streets, getting beaten up, while I've been sitting in this office. He stopped suddenly and looked at Sarah with newfound respect. You've been feeding him, protecting him, all this time without knowing who he was. When Sarah nodded, he reached out and took her hand. Thank you, he said simply, but his eyes said much more. The clock on the restaurant wall showed 5:55 p.m. Mr. Romano paced nervously near the entrance while Sarah watched from her station. The other staff members tried to work normally, but everyone's eyes kept drifting to the door. Even Mark seemed anxious about Tommy's arrival. What if he doesn't come today? Mr. Romano asked, checking his watch for the 10th time. What if those boys who tried to take his backpack scared him away? Sarah placed a gentle hand on his arm. He'll come, sir. He hasn't missed a single day in 3 weeks. She didn't add that she was worried too, especially after seeing Tommy's injuries earlier. The minutes ticked by slowly. 6 o'clock came and went. Mr. Romano's face grew more worried with each passing moment. Jen poked his head out of the kitchen every few minutes, the soup he had specially prepared for Tommy getting cold. At 6:15 p.m., just as everyone was starting to lose hope, the front door opened. Tommy walked in, his hair wet from the rain, looking more nervous than usual. He froze when he saw Mr. Romano standing there. Thomas, Mr. Romano whispered, taking a step forward. Tommy took a step back, his eyes wide with fear and shame. Dad, he said so quietly that Sarah could barely hear him. I'm sorry. His voice broke on the last word, and tears started rolling down his dirty cheeks. Mr. Romano didn't say anything. Instead, he ran forward and wrapped his arms around his son, not caring about his expensive soup getting wet and dirty. Father and son held each other tightly, both crying now, as the restaurant guests and staff watched in stunned silence. I thought I lost you forever, Mr. Romano sobbed, holding Tommy's face in his hands and looking at him through tears. Why did you run away? Why didn't you come to me? Tommy wiped his eyes with his sleeve. Mom's new boyfriend was mean to me, he said, his voice shaking. He would lock me in my room without food when Mom was at work. I tried to tell Mom, but she wouldn't believe me. Mr. Romano's face darkened with anger, but he kept his voice gentle. Why didn't you come home to me? I was ashamed, Tommy admitted, looking down at his torn clothes. I thought you'd be mad that I ran away, and then I saw your restaurant, but I was too scared to come in. I didn't want everyone to see what happened to me. So you came here instead? Mr. Romano asked, looking around his restaurant with new eyes. Tommy nodded, glancing at Sarah. I was so hungry that first night, and Sarah, she was so kind. She didn't judge me or ask too many questions. She just helped me. Mr. Romano turned to Sarah, who was trying to wipe away her own tears. You fed my son when he was hungry, showed him kindness when he was lost, and kept him safe until I could find him again. His voice was full of emotion. How can I ever repay you? Sarah shook her head. Seeing you two back together is all the payment I need, she said softly. Tommy suddenly looked worried. Dad, Sarah won't get in trouble for helping me, will she? Mark said it was against the rules. Mr. Romano laughed for the first time in months, the sound echoing through the restaurant. Rules? He said, putting one arm around Tommy and reaching out to take Sarah's hand with his free hand. Sometimes the most important rules are the ones written in our hearts, not in policy books. The restaurant burst into applause, with even some customers wiping away tears. Chen emerged from the kitchen with a fresh bowl of hot soup, and Maria brought over a clean napkin for Tommy to dry his eyes. Come on, son, Mr. Romano said gently. Let's get you home and cleaned up. And Sarah, he added, turning to her with grateful eyes, I believe we need to have a serious discussion about your future at this restaurant. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the Bellagio restaurant earlier than usual. Mr. Romano had asked her to come in before the lunch service began, and she felt nervous about what he might say. As she walked through the quiet dining room, memories of last night's emotional reunion played in her mind. The restaurant looked different in the morning light. Sunbeams streamed through the large windows, making the crystal chandeliers sparkle. Sarah noticed a cleaning crew working hard to polish the floors, and there were workers installing something new near the entrance. Good morning, Sarah, Mr. Romano called out from his office doorway. He looked like a completely different person today. His suit was crisp and neat, his hair was properly combed, and his eyes had regained their spark. Please come in. Sarah entered the office, noticing that the photograph of Tommy on the desk had been joined by several others. In one new picture, she could see Tommy sleeping peacefully in what must have been his old bedroom. He slept for 12 hours straight, Mr. Romanov said, following her gaze. The doctor came this morning to check him over. Apart from being underweight and having some minor bruises, he's going to be fine. His voice cracked slightly with emotion. Sarah smiled, relieved to hear that Tommy was safe and healthy. I'm so glad, sir. He's a special boy. Yes, he is, Mr. Romano agreed, sitting down behind his desk. And you're a special person, Sarah. That's why I called you here today. He pulled out some papers from his drawer. I've been thinking all night about how to thank you properly. Sarah started to protest, but Mr. Romano held up his hand. Please, let me finish. You didn't just feed my son. You showed him kindness when he needed it most. You risked your job to help a child you didn't even know. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city. This restaurant has been successful because we serve excellent food in an elegant setting. But somewhere along the way, we lost something more important, our humanity. Turning back to Sarah, he continued, that's why I've made some decisions. First, I'm promoting you to restaurant manager. Sarah's mouth fell open in surprise. Sir, I don't know what to say. There's more, Mr. Romano said, smiling. I'm also starting a new program at the restaurant. Did you notice the construction work near the entrance? When Sarah nodded, he explained, we're creating a small cafe section that will be open during the day. It will serve simple, affordable meals to anyone who needs them. He handed Sarah the papers from his desk. I want you to run this program. You'll have full authority to help anyone who comes in hungry, just like you helped Thomas. No questions asked, no judgment given. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the papers. The program was called Sarah's Corner, and the plan showed a warm, welcoming space where people could eat with dignity. But what about the other staff? She asked, thinking of Mark's disapproving looks. And the regular customers? Mr. Romano's face grew serious. Anyone who has a problem with this new policy can find work elsewhere. As for the customers, he smiled. Many of them witnessed what happened last night. The story has already spread, and our morning mail is full of messages supporting the idea. He reached into his drawer again and pulled out a small name tag. It reads Sarah Johnson, manager, in elegant gold letters. So, what do you say? Will you help me make this restaurant not just a place for fine dining, but also a place for fine human beings? Sarah couldn't speak for a moment. She thought about her own mother, who had struggled to feed her children. She thought about all the people like Tommy who needed help, but were too ashamed to ask. Finally, she looked up at Mr. Romano with determination in her eyes. Yes, she said firmly, taking the name tag. Yes, I would be honored. 1 month after Tommy's reunion with his father, the Bellagio restaurant had changed in ways nobody could have imagined. Sarah's Corner was now open, a warm and welcoming space that served simple but delicious meals to those in need. The smell of Chen's famous soup mixed with fresh bread filled the air as Sarah walked through the door for her morning shift. Good morning, Manager Johnson, called out Tommy, who was helping to set up the tables. He looked completely different now, clean, well-dressed, and healthy. His eyes sparkled with happiness as he arranged the flowers in small vases, something he had insisted on adding to make the space more cheerful. Sarah smiled at the boy who had changed not just her life, but the entire restaurant. Good morning, Tommy. Shouldn't you be getting ready for school? After moving back in with his father, Tommy had started attending the local private school, quickly catching up on the months he had missed. "Dad's taking me after we finish setting up," Tommy explained, carefully straightening a tablecloth. "I wanted to help before my first day back." The media had tried to turn their story into big news, but Mr. Romano had protected both Tommy and Sarah from too much attention. Instead, they had focused on quietly building something meaningful. Sarah's Corner now served over 100 meals each day to people who needed them. Mark, who had initially been against the whole idea, had surprised everyone by becoming one of the program's biggest supporters. He was now teaching cooking classes to homeless youth who wanted to learn kitchen skills. Sarah watched as he showed a teenage girl how to properly chop vegetables for the day's soup. "Sarah," called Maria excitedly from the entrance. "You need to see this." She was holding the morning newspaper. On the front page was a small but significant story. Tommy's mother had been arrested, and her boyfriend was being investigated for child abuse. Mr. Romano had finally gotten full custody of his son. "Does Tommy know?" Sarah asked quietly, taking the newspaper. She had grown protective of the boy over the past month, treating him like the little brother she never had. "I know," Tommy's voice came from behind them. He was holding his school backpack, looking more serious than usual. "Dad told me this morning. He said I don't have to go back there ever again." Sarah knelt down to his level, something she had done many times when he was still coming in as a hungry street child. "How do you feel about that?" Tommy thought for a moment. "Sad for Mom," he said honestly, "but happy that other kids won't get hurt like I did." He looked around at Sarah's Corner, where several people were already waiting for breakfast. "And happy that we're helping other people who need it." Mr. Romano appeared at the door, car keys in hand. "Ready for school, son?" He was wearing a chef's coat instead of his usual suit, another change that had come with the restaurant's transformation. He now spent more time cooking and less time in his office. "Almost, Dad," Tommy said, then turned back to Sarah. "Will you be here when I get back? I want to help serve dinner tonight." Sarah nodded, feeling proud of how much Tommy had grown. "Of course. But remember, homework comes first." As Tommy and his father left for school, Sarah looked around at what their restaurant had become. Jen was teaching another homeless youth how to make his famous soup. Maria was gently helping an elderly man find a comfortable seat. Even the regular fine dining customers had embraced the changes, often adding extra donations to their bills to support Sarah's Corner. A small boy walked in, looking as scared and hungry as Tommy had that first night. Sarah straightened her manager's badge and walked over to him with a warm smile. "Welcome," she said softly. "Would you like some breakfast?" 5 years had passed since the night Tommy first pressed his face against the restaurant window. The Bellagio restaurant had become famous not just for its fine dining, but for the way it had changed the community. On this special evening, the restaurant was closed for a private celebration. Sarah stood in front of the mirror in her office, the same office that had once belonged to Mr. Romano. She adjusted her dress and touched the small plaque on her desk that reads Sarah Johnson, Executive Director, Bellagio Community Programs. The restaurant now had 5 Sarah's Corners across the city, each one helping hundreds of people every day. "Mom says the guests are starting to arrive," Tommy announced, poking his head into her office. At 17, he had grown into a tall, handsome young man. He was wearing a suit that matched his father's, and his school valedictorian medal gleamed on his chest. "Thanks, Tommy," Sarah smiled. She could hardly believe this confident teenager was the same scared, hungry boy she had fed soup to 5 years ago. "Is everything ready in the main room?" "Perfect." Tommy grinned. "Chen's got all the food prepared, and Mark's got the new trainees lined up to serve. You won't believe how many people came." The main dining room had been transformed for the evening. Instead of separate tables, there was one long table that stretched through the entire restaurant. Rich and poor, famous and unknown, all would sit together tonight to celebrate what had begun with one simple act of kindness. As Sarah walked into the dining room, she saw familiar faces everywhere. There was David, who had come to Sarah's Corner 3 years ago as a homeless teenager and was now one of their best chefs. Maria, now retired but still volunteering every week, sat next to a group of children from their after-school program. Mark, who had completely changed from his previously judgmental attitude, was showing off pictures of the culinary school they had opened for underprivileged youth. Mr. Romano stood up and gently tapped his glass for attention. The room fell silent as he began to speak. 5 years ago, he said, his voice full of emotion, I was a broken man who had lost his son. My restaurant was successful, but my heart was empty. Then one rainy evening, a waitress showed more humanity than I had in all my years of running this place. He gestured to Sarah to join him at the front of the room. Sarah didn't just feed my son. She showed us all what it means to be truly human. She taught us that success isn't measured by how much money we make, but by how many lives we touch. Tommy stood up next, holding a small covered tray. When I was living on the streets, I thought I had lost everything. But thanks to Sarah, I found not just my father again, but a whole new family. He unveiled the tray, revealing a beautiful cake decorated with the words, 5 years of hope. Today, Sarah addressed the room, her voice steady and clear. We're not just celebrating 5 years of Sarah's Corner. We're celebrating every person in this room who has helped turn this restaurant into something more than just a place to eat. We're celebrating every person who has come here hungry and left not just with a full stomach, but with hope. She looked around at the faces before her, the wealthy donors who had helped expand the program, the volunteers who gave their time, the people whose lives had been changed, the staff who had become family. In this room, there are no differences between us. We're all just people sharing a meal together, just like that first night when a hungry boy needed help. The room burst into applause as Chen and his team began serving the celebration dinner. At the table, Tommy sat between his father and Sarah, exactly where he belonged. As Sarah looked around at what their restaurant had become, a place where kindness was served daily alongside the food, she remembered something her mother used to say, sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can create the biggest changes in the world. And she knew, watching the room full of people whose lives had been touched by that one simple decision to help a hungry child, that her mother had been absolutely right.